Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope the rest of the day has been enjoyable so far. And you've got some energy left to have this conversation. My name is Joe Roberts. I'm one of the caseworkers and project coordinators at Praxis. The reason I'm chairing this, I guess, is because I'm the project coordinator for the London Youth Gateway project, which is a youth-focused project that we take up with New Horizons, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. We're going to have a conversation here about sort of the way that migrant homelessness affects young people specifically, and the intersection of youth, immigration status, homelessness, and the many of the challenges that come along with that. We have a few people here to speak for us today. We have Christian McNamara, who is the Senior Project and Policy Officer for Rough Sleeping at the GLA, who's going to talk to us a little bit about a report the GLA did a couple of years ago now about numbers of undocumented young people in London, and also a little bit more than that too. We have Aminat and Saeed, who are members of our group, service user group at Praxis Brighter Futures, which is a youth-focused group of clients and service users who come together weekly to socialise and campaign, and I'll tell you a bit more in detail about what they do later, so I won't steal all of that. And then we have Phil, who is the CEO of New Horizons, which is a day centre and support service for young people and young migrants specifically, based just around the corner, and obviously we will tell you a lot more about that later on. So we will start with Christian.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Give me a shout if I need to speak up. We're going to start by talking about the report that Joe mentioned, which was published in January 2020, commissioned by the GLA and completed by the University of Wolverhampton and the Institute for Community Research and Development. Now, some of the purpose of that report was to develop an evidence base to estimate both the size and the nature of the undocumented population in London and in the UK. The key findings from that report were that something like half of all the UK's undocumented adults and children were in London, and that's around 400,000 people. Within that were 26,000 undocumented young people, so that's people aged 18 to 24. And in addition to that, 96,000 EEA young people who, before the June 2021 deadline, required no permit to lawfully reside in the UK, but who now do. And one of the key risks flagged in that report was the barriers that exist to people achieving settled status, and that many of those people would end up becoming undocumented through not having their status confirmed through the settled status scheme. Many of us in this room who've worked with people in that situation will know that they face a long and complex and often expensive journey in order to confirm their status. And in addition to that, it's also worth recognising the issue of recourse to public funds. And the Mayor has been saying for a long time that there is a specific vulnerability relating to no recourse to public funds for families, young people and children, and their risk of poverty and destitution. We know that they can't access mainstream housing, healthcare, or welfare benefits. And the Mayor's Pan-London Rough Sleeping services are seeing increasing numbers of people beginning to rough sleep for the first time for those reasons. The chain system, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but in case of people joining remotely who aren't, which is a system that records commission services interactions with people who are rough sleeping in London, saw 3,500 people who are non-UK nationals rough sleeping in the capital last year alone, but only around a quarter of those upon initial assessment had some sort of status or leave to remain. So we are seeing thousands of people joining the rough sleeping population every year, for the drivers that I mentioned and that were highlighted in the report, as well as because not having recourse to public funds. So I know I've started on quite a serious note, and I'll try and sort of move more towards positive things before I hand over to my colleagues. But it's worth saying that the Mayor is committed to supporting young Londoners to access their rights to citizenship, as well as explore routes to confirm their status in the UK. And he's invested in a number of services and resources to help young Londoners achieve that. Primary amongst those is a children and young people's service, which is hosted on a website that's part of the London Migrants Hub. That's something you can find online by just searching for children and young Londoners. And that's a broad resource for people to explore, as I mentioned, citizenship and right to reside in the UK. Alongside that, he's invested in services, and the key aspect of those is that they are available to people irrespective of their immigration support needs, their immigration status, or recourse to public funds. And we've heard throughout today, I think, that if you make services available to people, there are very, very good chances that they will achieve a positive outcome. That's also evidenced through one of the services that myself and Phil and DePaul UK also worked on last year, which was the Youth Hub, which again had no access requirements around immigration status or recourse to public funds, which over a 12-month period supported 34 people who were non-UK citizens or had some sort of restricted leave to remain, whether that be discretionary leave, refugee status, as they're asylum seekers, or they're just undocumented. And 24 of those, so 3/4, achieved a positive move on outcome into settled accommodation, which is an equal proportion to people who were UK citizens and had full entitlements. We also saw in the hub that there was an enhanced level of engagement with employment, training and education services, and people achieved positive outcomes in those areas as well. So I think it's the takeaway from us as commissioners from that was that if you make services available to people, that it's quite possible to achieve very good outcomes across a broad range of metrics, whether that be health, housing, employment, that actually someone's status itself doesn't mean that they're not able to achieve good outcomes if you remove the barriers to them accessing support. I'll just mention a couple of other things. So there's the Holistic Assessment Service. That's an emergency accommodation service for people with unclear entitlements at the point they're met, with medium to high support needs. Immigration advice is attached to that, which is delivered by Mauritian Refugee and Migrant Network. And there's also mental health assessment, which is delivered by EASL, the University College London Hospital Service. And then finally, which one service I think is worth mentioning, which is very relevant for this group, which is the Roma rough sleeping mediation service. And the key aspect of that, in addition to immigration advice, is culturally specific and competent casework and outreach, as well as training for the sector on how to meaningfully engage a specific cohort and achieve good outcomes. That's all I'll say for now. I'll just go back to mention the report, which I think just gives an idea of the scale of undocumented young people who are in London at the moment, and we're seeing those people flow to the streets, and that there is a need for a broad range of services, but ultimately if you provide them and you enable people to access them, you can achieve good outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, the numbers are kind of quite stark when you put them on paper like that, I think, but I think that's usually the takeaway from the whole day is this idea of give someone a place to stay and some support network, you can make real progress, whereas it's so difficult to do that without it. So moving on from that to sort of the more personal side of it and the lived experience, we're going to have a little bit of information from Anat and Saeed of Brighter Futures, at their Brighter Futures as a group, I believe. If Anat, I believe you'll take your starting.
Hello everyone, my name is Saeed.
And I'm Aminat. We are members of Brighter Futures, a group of young migrants between the ages of 18 and 30 who come together to have fun, build a family in London, speak up for the rights of young people like us. We are fighters for challenge, we are fighters for change and justice. We want to transform the way the UK sees young migrants and challenge the hostile environment's effects on young migrants' lives. This includes access to safe, secure, and appropriate housing. Before we get started on this feed, I'd just like to do a quick survey, raise of hands, anyone who had their own rooms between the ages of 18 and 25 or shared with a sibling. Great, thank you. It's just for my own curiosity. But I would like to speak to you today about the system, the broken system. Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story of a young Brighter Futures member, Anna. Let me tell you Michael's story. In fact, let me tell you my story. My story, my search for safety and stability. It is a story of fear and a journey surviving a broken system that pushes you towards homelessness and turns its back on you in your time of need. It is a story of complete luck and the kindness of strangers that saved the lucky few from sleeping on the streets. I came to London when I was young, about 12, and I joined foster care. I lived with a foster family where I felt safe because I had people who cared about me and a place to call my own. At 21, social services moved me into a shared accommodation, all without asking me or giving me any choice. I was moved into a small room, 2 single beds for myself and another girl. With one small window and very little space, it felt like there was no room to breathe. I would dream about the mold spreading across the walls, feeling it crawling across my skin. The smell would make me sick, taking over my nose. I would imagine it spreading across my lungs. I would lie there all night, feeling my body tense and shiver every time I heard someone turn or go to the toilet. She was a stranger to me and I was a stranger to her. Yet, we were forced to sleep opposite each other. We didn't even speak the same languages. The only thing we had in common was our sadness. A sadness which is very contagious. When I was sad, she felt my sadness. And she was sad. Her sadness was the only thing I felt as well. I couldn't even cry alone, and neither could she. I got to know young people who really needed a safe home. They were homeless due to a breakdown in relationships, due to not being safe, due to trafficking, or struggling with mental health issues and trauma. We all needed safety and stability that could not be provided in these conditions. I would watch young people leave, scared that I would be next. Some were moved to other cities while others just couldn't take it anymore. My heart would beat so hard in my chest every time I saw a letter through the letterbox or hear my phone ring with an unknown number. I would take a deep breath and answer the phone, waiting for the news that my life would be thrown into complete chaos all over again. Then the news finally came. On the day I turned 25, the social services closed my case because I was too old. So I became homeless. I was too old at 25. 25, I was old, they said. At 25, I was still scared. I was confused and I didn't know where to go or what to do. I'd never been independent before. I was never allowed to be. I was too scared to ask for help because I thought I would be deported.
Luckily, I eventually found brighter futures and supportive community who could get me the help I needed from an advisor. They made a referral to refugees at home, and I was moved into a kind lady's spare room. I was only meant to stay there for 1 month, but the Home Office wanted me to move to Manchester. How could I move to Manchester? I couldn't even point it out on a map. I only lived in London. I had never stepped a foot outside London since I moved to the UK. It was all I ever knew, and the only family I had ever knew. Here I was again with any choice, stuck in a broken system, scared for the future. Luckily, the lady let me stay longer. She saw something in me when others hadn't. She saw I had a future. I had no income, so she kindly gave me pocket money to support my needs. I could finally afford a food and to travel to college. But not everyone gets this chance. Not everyone is saved by a kindness of strangers or find a community that can give them support. Not everyone is saved from homelessness, and they can be taken advantage of. The system is broken. To end migrant youth homelessness, we need to tackle the hostile environment. The uncaring immigration system continues to force young migrants onto the street and live without a safety net. The system is broken. The never-ending threat of homelessness leaves young people feeling so low. We have no control, no choice. We need to see people as individuals. Where is the humanity in this? The system is broken. There needs more funding for youth homelessness. We need better access to support. We need knowledge. We need knowledge of where we can go and who we can turn to.
We need to fix the system. We shouldn't have to rely on luck, chance, or like kindness of strangers. The government needs to be more like this kind stranger and offer a hand, open a home to people in need. Thank you.
Thank you both. Sorry, the TV's turned up. Thank you very much. So I guess the next step after that is to move on to Phil. And then after that, I will speak briefly about practices for response, but I think Phil's going to talk to us about what New Horizons is doing and the challenges and what we face.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Phil, I'm the Chief Executive at New Horizons Youth Centre. And for those who don't know us, we are about a 3-minute walk that way, just behind the British Library. I've been going for 55 years, and that's because every year thousands of young people in London become homeless through no fault of their own. And as we know, the services that to support them often are over capacity. So we provide a range of services in our building through outreach and remotely to ensure that young people can improve their economic circumstance, their health, and ultimately find somewhere that they can call home. Just for a bit of context, we probably support about 1,200 young people every year. About 33% of them are sleeping rough, 10% just under would be refugees and asylum seekers, 10% probably wouldn't have, would be no recourse to public funds. So that's our community. The situation in London, as Christian's alluded to, is a much more complex one. I know Centrepoint estimate that every year about 15,000 young people approach their council either because they're about to be homeless or are homeless. And our own data shows that that's only about half the problem, because only 48% of the young people who come to New Horizons, including migrants, wouldn't necessarily know they even could approach a council, or even if they knew about it, wouldn't necessarily do it. So the issue is quite large. We estimate that to be a double-decker bus's worth of young people becoming homeless in the capital every single day. And that sheer scale of the issue does not match the kind of actual low level of provision that is out there. So that's kind of one big area. I think in terms of youth homelessness as a whole, it's a complex issue in some ways. There are lots of different factors that young people become homeless. We know the main one is family breakdown, but as we've heard here, escaping violence, fleeing persecution, issues at home, sexual, domestic abuse all play into it. In terms of supporting young people, supporting young migrants, if you ask the team, I think there's two particular challenges that we see regularly. One is around when young people turn 18. So they may be in services already. This could be unaccompanied asylum seeking children. It might just be children that are growing up in the UK, going about their lives, going to school, actually then start going to work, and something happens, either they become homeless or they end up in prison and suddenly realise that their status isn't actually clear, and at the point they need to access state support, they can't do so. So there is definitely something about how we better educate families that are, growing up here, paying taxes here, about making sure that their status is clear, so that if their children do need support, it is there for them. That's the first thing. The second thing probably just very much builds on what Amanat was saying as part of her story, and Saeed is just, and it sort of relates back to no recourse to public funds. The immigration system is, as one of my colleagues described it, a minefield, but I think you probably better described it. It's broken. It takes a long time to sort out these situations with young people, and especially those who've got no recourse to public fund. There just isn't ample provision out there. So while that is happening, we do our best to make do. So we mentioned the youth hub for young people sleeping rough, we have an emergency fund to put people into hotels and backpackers for short periods of time, work with other charities to find accommodation where it's possible. But we do need to think about how we can speed up the processes or have acknowledged that this is a thing and have ample provision, particularly accommodation there for young people. The last thing, just I would say, a general point that we make about youth homelessness constantly is, if you don't design young people into systems from the start, you exclude them effectively. So we know that young people become homeless for different reasons. We know they experience homelessness for different reasons. And within that, young migrants are an absolute subset. So we need to recognise this as a problem. We need to really think about the solutions and design them into generic housing and homelessness services, because if they're not designed from the start, we end up with situations the young person we would have heard about where the provision just can't be accessed in a meaningful or timely way. So I'll leave it there, and it's up to you, Joe, for some questions.
Yeah, and I guess I will, I imagine everyone's heard plenty about what Praxis do already today, so we won't go on too long, but we should talk about one of the main things that's been set up recently, or at least that Praxis have become involved in recently, which specifically works with young people, which is the London Youth Gateway, which is a partnership led by New Horizons, but of which Praxis is a partner alongside a few other housing advice organisations like Paul and Shelter, and also LGBTQ plus specialist organisations like Stonewall Housing, AKT and Gallup, who are working as a partnership as an attempt to alleviate youth homelessness, or young people becoming homeless in London, across London, funded by London Council. The focus being on prevention, on people who are at risk of homelessness, rather than being on supporting people who are already rough sleepers. Praxis's involvement in that is reasonably new, and has come about as a recognition of what we've been talking about today, of essentially that a huge proportion of the people that are rough sleeping or become rough sleepers have immigration issues, or are undocumented, or cannot access services or support that they need to avoid destitution and homelessness. So that is the main part, aside from Brighter Futures. That is the main thing that Praxis is doing in terms of working towards trying to alleviate the risk of migrant youth homelessness. But the issue is obviously, as Phil's already said, and from the figures that Christian's given us earlier on, our team is of one advisor and myself as a coordinator. We're a very small team, and we cannot resolve the issue alone. And there's a huge amount more work to be done to be able to make sure that the risk is alleviated as far as possible. But I guess we'll close there from the panel. In a minute, we will open up for questions, but I think before we do that, we're going to do some Slido questions.
Yes.
I think everyone in the room now hopefully knows quite well what Slido is and how it works, but for those at home who might not have been here this morning, there'll be a link, I think, posted in the chat, and a few questions for us to answer collectively, which I will say slowly while Maria does it. So you should.
Yeah. So there is that. Yeah, that's right. So can you see the you can scan the questions over there?
And those at home should be able to join from slido.com and that number. And I'll give you a minute to sign in, and then we can go through a few sort of group questions to try and get a sort of picture of what people think.
Hi.
So the first question we have is, how do you think the problems faced by young migrants are reflected in the solutions proposed in the rough sleeping strategy? I guess this relies somewhat on people having read the rough sleeping strategy. But yeah, I think there is some reference to, or some kind of limited reference to young people, and maybe something we'll talk about in a bit, reference directly to young people who are leaving care and the support available to people leaving care. But the specificity of young people otherwise in that rough sleeping support is quite limited, I think.
The second question.
And the second question, do you think the government policies do enough to protect migrant young people from homelessness?
No.
That's fine. We'll technically do that one.
Okay.
And then the final question
is,
How well do you think the problem faced by young migrants? No, I think we could have done that one.
sorry. Which of the following, yeah.
Which of the following do you think describes the immigration status of the majority of young people that you work with? Which might be an interesting one just to see where people are.
Okay. I love this ambivalence. Any questions? No one will have. Combination.
Okay, so the majority of people working with a lot of people who maybe have status but aren't able to access support. And
It wasn't an option for the commander.
I think they should be.
No.
I thought that was, okay, well. We'll assume that's one, not applicable means. Okay, well, thank you for that, everyone. I guess now we can open up questions from the room to begin with, and then if there are any questions from people on Zoom, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and we'll come to those when we've done a couple of questions here.
But we don't have microphones here, you just have to speak up.
Yeah, you just have to share out.
I do have a question. It's originated by this poll. So 100% of us think that the government is not doing enough to prevent migrant youth homelessness. And I wonder whether we all think this because we work with the cases that have been difficult. And so what we see is the lower end of the spectrum, or are there success stories, or is what we're seeing representative of what is happening across the board?
I mean, I think we heard from some representatives from the Home Office earlier about the escalation route and cases being resolved that way, like a large number of cases being resolved that way. And we definitely welcomed that opportunity to have direct contact with the Home Office during everyone in, especially because, you know, that accommodation going on for such a long period of time, being open access was incredible. You know, we all know this, but we did reach a point where we're like, the only people who are going to be left in this accommodation are people without clear status or entitlements. And we needed something additional in order to resolve that. It couldn't be done off the backs of, you know, caseworkers. They needed Home Office support. So that's where that route, that escalation route came from. And that continues to provide opportunities to local authorities to escalate cases to the Home Office. So that is an avenue. But in terms of the strategy, there was an omission. I mean, you could call it a deliberate omission from the strategy on anything specific for migrants. You know, we do work very closely with Department for Levelling Up, and our services are able to support rough sleepers who have unclear immigration status or no recourse to public funds, including money that's paid to us from the government to deliver those services. But you have to kind of fight for every penny and every person who is helped in that way. And there's a bit of an either-or attitude, I think, where it's like if you spend a certain amount of money and time, normally longer, resolving someone's status, getting them access to welfare benefits, you could potentially help 3, 4, 7, 10 people who have UK citizenship who are currently rough sleeping instead. And I think we're getting to the point now where we're anticipating changes in spending in probably in the very near future, maybe as soon as tomorrow. And what that means for striking that balance between helping the largest number of people versus helping those who are most excluded from the system and without specific interventions will never access the support they need to access sleeping. So I think it's an increasing challenge.
So I think it's about the intersection, isn't it? So if you look at government rough sleeping strategy in particular, one of the questions, we've worked really hard to get young people on there. And actually, if you look at the version 4 years ago, the one that was released I think a couple of months ago, there's a lot about young people in there in a way that there just wasn't before. So I think the government really are listening actually that young people need specific and different support. The migrant bit, as Christian said, just isn't in there. Although what I was told earlier today was that the new minister in the meeting with Homeless Link has actually said, I want to look at this. So it's, the government have always stonewalled the issue previously, but for the first time they are saying actually we do recognise that this requires specific and different thinking. So I think there is potentially a window of opportunity, spending review and all the rest of it notwithstanding, to get the issues of migrant homelessness more on the map with government. Whether the route to young migrants is through the young people's route or the migrant route, or whether you can also try and get the overlay of the two, I think there is a potential opportunity. The problem the big problem we've got generally with homelessness at the moment is short-term ism with government, and what's going to happen tomorrow with the spending review, where there is going to be a push to make cuts, and people aren't thinking about the long-term costs that are going to get accrued in society by not helping when we need to help, and that is right now. As a particular thing on that, just as an example of a kind of potential watershed moment, the government in its rough sleeping strategy admitted for the first time that 48% of all adult rough sleepers first slept rough under the age of 25. It's quite an astounding figure. So if there was ever a more compelling case to get this right for young people, that is it. I just don't think we're going to be able to do that because we're going to be cutting budgets hard, probably from tomorrow. So that's the challenge we face.
Anybody else have any questions? I've got a few in my back pocket in case nobody has anything. So, go on.
I wanted to ask if you guys could just speak a bit more specifically about any specific barriers or issues that young people experiencing homelessness might face using more general homelessness support services, like why, for example, New Horizons is necessary as a specific youth center rather than having them use other services.
Yeah, so there's a number of different ways of answering that. Partly it's about safety, partly it's about stigma, and partly it's about people's experiences. So if you think about rough sleeping, kind of endless conundrum on this is that young people tend to sleep rough or experience the streets, you might say, in different ways because they don't feel safe. They're not going to be outside King's Cross Station when you commute home because some of the adults are there and they won't feel safe being there. See that time and time again. So they tend to hang out on buses. If they are bedded down, they do it in ways that are quite invisible. So there's a safety thing. There is also just a stigma thing. You know, young people don't like to be in a room full of adults who perhaps more entrenched in their homelessness. And people come into our centre all the time and say, "Is everyone here homeless?" And you say, "Yeah." And they're like, "They don't look it." Well, no, of course they don't. They're young people who's getting on with their lives. But the main reason is the kind of the nuances of their situation. It is fundamentally different. You know, the wages they're paid, the support they can access, what is available to them or not is determined by age a lot in this country. And so the same will be true as another subset of that based on your immigration status. And so you do need specialists and different support from time and time again. That's why we argue for it and why government and other bodies will come to agencies like us and say, how do we do this? It was interesting, the Everyone In Hotel was a brilliant initiative during the pandemic as they started to get moved on, which was the predominant group that was left behind and people couldn't move them on, young people. And that was because everyone suddenly had that moment of, oh right, oh, these things aren't available to them in the way that they are adults, so they got stuck.
Yeah, I think interesting mentioning the immigration aspect of that as well. Often from a cynical immigration advisor's perspective, being a young person is often an opportunity, and sometimes it's an opportunity that can have quite drastic impact if you miss that opportunity. We had a referral through the London Youth Gateway very recently of someone who could have met the rules when they were under 18 to qualify for status, but didn't have support, and now is 21, but won't meet the rules that now apply to them for another 2 years because the rules are different for those that are over and under 18. And it's those sorts of things where you could make an incredibly transformative difference to that person's life if you were just able to intervene at the right time. And then also, I suppose, the reflection back on that is for the Home Office people in the room is the issue of where, and this is something we've discussed before, of those hard barriers of, or the hard deadlines between 18 and 19 and between 25 and 26, and where that comes from. Not that I'm trying to queue up any questions. Does anyone else have any questions?
I just add a bit to the ladies' questions as well. I think there's a bit of like age discrimination there as well when it comes to like young people, like even in like immigration cases as well, whereby say there could be a difference between Saeed and me who like with the same age, maybe like he was born 2 days after. That in itself is like, well, you don't qualify this because like you're like 2 days above the limit, if you understand that. And then that comes into play as well. And then with the homeless thing as well, say, for example, they put you in a foster care or a home that you don't feel safe in and you decided on your own to leave, then they're like, well, you voluntarily made yourself homeless, so we can't help you. But I'm telling you that I didn't feel safe in this environment. But they will reply to you and say, well, you did it to yourself, kind of thing. And then you're like, you're at a loss, like, so where do we go from here now? And it's a thing where, especially for young people who don't have like established status, you're too scared to like go into places that could potentially be able to help you, because it's very easy to be like, oh, go to this place, you can find help here. But as a young person in that precarious situation, you're constantly on alert, you're constantly scared like someone's out to get me, you know. And then just think, if you're constantly like that, the effects that has on your mental health, you're struggling with so many different things as well. You're homeless. And then if it wasn't for like groups like Praxis or Brighter Futures, where you find friendships and support, like what would happen to you? That kind of thing.
Does anyone else? The hand went quiet.
I was just wondering, I work for Mungos, and like obviously all of our changes are set up for adults, and like it does feel like this, like I don't know, outreach or like anything or whatever, like the mainstream services, they're all set up for adults. Like now that we have youth homelessness in the strategy and like kind of this chain that is like kind of is there any drive actually from government and the GLA to kind of set up more specific services for youth? Like is this thing now? You know, I just from my perspective, obviously I don't know the whole sector, but like it does feel that everything is set up for adults, and like there are so many specific things that we just don't just very difficult to address, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and a helpful challenge as well. And I think Phil touched on the needs that differ for young people and how those don't really work in a setting which is designed primarily for adults. And we definitely recognise that with the GLA, and you know, that's part of why we're doing the Youth Hub to evidence that a different model can work. And we're hoping that there will be opportunities to replicate that service in bigger ways across London in the near future. In terms of other services, I think, were you talking just about young adults, so 18 to 24-year-olds, or children as well? Young adults.
Yeah, children is
different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's always a need to reflect how well your services meet your understanding of the rough sleeping population. And I think we're doing a lot more work as a team to try and understand the impact of our services on different groups, whether that be migrants, whether that be ethnic minorities, whether it be young people. And you know, we have good data which shows the number of people who are rough sleeping on any given night or any given week or month in London, but there's a need to look at how well our services match up with that in terms of the people that are entering. And I think, you know, we haven't done that analysis yet, and I think that's a big gap for us, but I think that will show up some quite stark realities for some of our services. And then we need to look back at how we commission services. Like, do we build into the structure of the service how it's going to meet the needs of specific groups? I think in the past we haven't done that as well, to be quite frank, as well as we should be doing. It's definitely an intention from our team, and I definitely welcome that challenge. And I think the fact that it's in the strategy and that we've got like friendly partners who are experts in this area who are kind of supporting us to deliver the first kinds of these services that meet specific groups is really, really like welcome and a really, really great development.
And I completely agree. Although what I would say is there has been quite a lot of progress, particularly over the last 4 years. So the GLA really has stepped up. Michelle from London Council was at the back as well. The London Council's GLA have really stepped in the agenda and recognised that young people need specific and different support and appropriately ring-fence budgets to enable it to happen. If you want to push it further, particularly going back to this, like wouldn't it be great to have a young migrant service? It was particularly around their housing, while some of these immigration things got worked through, which we know takes a lot of time. We've got lots of young people with unclear status in the youth hub, and we could have another youth hub or several of them, probably just for young migrants. So I think that could be a longer term ambition. I think the problem with young people is when you, as you were on the front bench here, when you look at it at a specific borough level, there's never quite enough young people to make it work. But when you look at it across London, there are a lot of young people. It does need tackling at a pan-London level, really clear about that, or maybe sub-regionally. I think I would give London's politics credit, actually, it has recognised this problem.
Cool. And I think one more question. I think Michelle, talking of London's politics.
Yeah, I suppose those mistakes that we do need to use those in the short term, not the long term. We have opportunities through SHAP. That's in the strategy, isn't it, to develop more support housing for people, and you definitely make a case for it. I think for me, it's something I keep going on about the data, I'm so bored. But our outreach system is built on data that was about street counts, about visible visible locations, people that would be counted when we went out and did street counts. For 20 years, that's been the model on which we assess the scale of receiving. It's skewed massively towards men over 25s and people that feel safe to sleep visibly in central places where outreach teams can find them, and massively discriminate against young people, women, migrants, other paying people that don't feel safe. And I think that is like we're in a space now where we can change that. We have a Secretary of State that similarly data assess who went away and came back. We should be grateful for that, I think, because he's interested in data, the new indicators of the strategy. The first time in my time, I won't just say what's evening is measured by how many people count the rain Thursday, November, but it's going to say what about the people that dropped on the streets and came off with the flow, or the people that had one night. So I think that data is our friend in this space, because we can't argue for resource without being able to demonstrate the problem beyond the level that anecdote. And I think that Jill and I have talked about this need for a person's census as opposed to a visible outreach, which we've done with women, because I think that's how we find the hidden young people and young migrants, both of whom are marginalised for just the greater Muslim states. And we know in everyone in that thousands more people went into that Travelodge embarking than we expected, and they didn't do it because the Travelodge embarking is a wonderful place to spend the day. They were there on the streets, we just didn't know they were there. That's why we were surprised so many more people were housed during the morning, and a lot of them were young people. And the T1000 project, which is London's most entrenched and complex 1,000 receivers, which we started in July 2020, it's your point. If you look at them, 16% of them, that T1000, most marginalised, most entrenched, hardest to get off the streets. 1 in 6 of them first ever off. 4 down 25. So if you don't get it right when they're young, when they might be just on and off the streets and look actually like they're not vulnerable, you'll be doing it on the 1,000s forever with growing a new cohort and treacherous students from the university. So I think the data is where we need to put work in the groups and months to try and evidence what is a difficult group of people to make visible in a way that is less goes.
I think Maria has a question.
I've got a question from Marike. Thank you, Marike, for the question. And it's a fantastic question to wrap up. It's for the YP, so the young people, so brighter futures, there you go. If there is one thing that would make a difference and we should collectively make a noise about, what would that be? So what do you want us to make noise about?
That's probably on the spot.
There's so many different things, it's hard to choose. I think just to piggyback on what the lady at the back said, is like there's always like more young people on the streets than you would think. Just because they're never in the obvious places doesn't mean that they're not rough sleeping. And if we could, like, if people could have a safe space to live in, and like not have to live with strangers who you don't speak the same language with, or you don't share any faith or anything with, I think that could make a difference. And I guess another thing, maybe for me on a personal level, is like the age discrimination thing. Like, who gets to decide when you're too old, or if you meet a category or not? Like, my age shouldn't have to like discriminate against, I shouldn't be discriminated against because of my age.
Thank you.
You wanna add anything?
Okay, I think that's all we got time for then. So thank you for everyone that joined us, and thank you for everyone in the room and everyone at home. And we'll call it a day there.
We should definitely.
Okay,
This
I'm
next
ready
phase
to-
thing, we can make happen, but we can't. It's got, we just.
I get it. Yeah.